about to get started. Good evening, everyone. Did you enjoy that little cocktail reception we have there? That was nice, hey? Some delicious dumplings and some delicious salads. I want to give a huge shout out to our chef of the hour. I know these two are following him, but he was the chef of the hour. So thank you to Chef Justin Chung of Potluck Hawker Eatery. If you guys haven't been, you guys need to check it out. It's so delicious. These two went and ate pretty much everything on the menu. Favorite dish?
Tomorrow morning.
If you want to hang out with them, you can go back. What was your favorite dish there?
Chili crab.
There you have it. The chili crab. You got to go there and do the chili crab. That's right. Big ticket items, right, Justin? These guys have your back. You can see fellow industry folk. So thank you to Chef Justin and his two cooks who were with us today. And as well, thank you to Lily from Mission Hill Wines. She is their only Chinese sommelier, has done some really amazing things with them. To be a woman of color, to break through in an organization like that is really quite remarkable. So thank you for joining us, Lily, and great job, Ray, for finding all these amazing young talent to be with us this evening. So hello, everyone. My name is Lien Yeung. I am a news anchor with CBC News. I'm also a reporter there. I'm delighted to be your MC this evening and moderator of this conversation. I like to eat. I like to eat a lot. If those of you who follow me on Instagram will realize, I like to eat so much. Canada's Top 100 asked me to be a judge with them, so I've been doing that for a little bit, but yeah, that's just the fun thing I do on the side. So, but tonight, this evening, this event really merges my interests, which is talking about food, talking about Chinese food. So there we go. But before I formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered tonight on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we're so grateful for them to be here, to be sharing in this space. So tonight, this event is called FutureTalk. It is a new addition to the Chinese Restaurant Awards dining series called Dining by the Awards. And it's one of Vancouver's first speaker sessions examining Chinese cuisine as a focus. Can you believe that? I can't believe we haven't talked about it before. So Ray, the lovely Ray right there, and her colleagues are hoping to build a community of thinkers and doers and passionate diners to rediscover Chinese cuisine. And before welcoming these chefs, I'd like to invite our Dining by the Awards 2022 presenting sponsor and tonight's host venue, Gryphon Development's Marketing Director, Calvin Poon, to come up and say a couple of words. Calvin. Yeah, just turn around and look at the kitchen.
I'm here, I have a semi-loud voice. I just want to thank everyone for coming, and also to thank Ray for letting us be a sponsor again this year. We sponsored back in 2019, and a bit about Gryphon really quickly. We love to celebrate art, as you might have noticed throughout our space, and celebrating like the kind of culinary journey, especially being an Asian developer. It's just like, the match just is kind of perfect. So yeah, we're here again, and I'd love to share our space with everyone, and yeah, enjoy.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
It's so good, I almost bought it.
I know, the new development's very cool. Okay, at the end of this session, you can ask Calvin to show you the party trick with his bed. Let me tell you, it moves up and down. Okay, dirty minds, don't think about it. It literally actually is like on hydraulics, goes up and down. It's very cool. I know, right? It is useful for smaller spaces. Look, we're just selling condos, selling food for Justin. This is what we're doing. All right, so tonight we are delving into the future of Chinese cuisine with two outstanding young chefs. They sit beside me. They're dubbed the new generation, Chef Eva Chin from Toronto and Chef Lucas Sin from New York. And I want to give a little bit of their bio so we kind of know where these guys are coming from, because I don't think everybody is entirely familiar with their background. So Eva is the executive chef at Aveling in Toronto. So she grew up on her grandmother's farm in Hawaii and learned at an early age that food is a connection between people and the land. She's cooked in renowned kitchens all over the world, from Japan to Norway to Australia. She's backpacked throughout China, all the provinces, from the south all the way to the Himalayas, right? And following her stint as chef de cuisine at Boulevard Kitchen in Vancouver, Eva made the move to Toronto to helm the kitchen at Kojin by Momofuku. Never heard of them, right? She refers to herself as a Hapa, embracing her mixed ancestry. Her mother is Samoan Hawaiian, and her father is Singaporean Chinese. And most recently, Chef Eva is focused on launching her passion project, the Soy Luck Club, Obviously, yeah, I know. Play off of Joy Luck Club. Telling life stories through her food and how I wish I lived in Toronto to try that food because it seems incredible. So welcome to Eva. Yes. And to her right, her hype man, Lucason. Chef Lucason opened his first restaurant at the age of 16 in an abandoned newspaper factory in his hometown of Hong Kong at Yale University. He studied cognitive science and English, but spent his weekends running a pop-up restaurant. After graduating, he cooked in world-class kitchens in Seattle, Hong Kong, New York, and Kyoto before opening up Junzi Kitchen, a fast casual chain with the mission of updating the American understanding of Chinese cuisine. And during the pandemic, he launched Nice Day, a takeout spot focused on celebrating American Chinese classic dishes and putting a twist on them, e.g., macaroni and cheese mapo tofu. Mapo tofu mac and cheese, yes. Yeah, embarrassing, but you also love it, so don't be embarrassed. Lucas has been named one of Food and Wine's best new chefs, Forbes 30 Under 30, and an eater young gun. Please welcome Lucas Sin. So two very not accomplished people at all beside me tonight. It's the Asian way of saying it. Yeah, it is. I know. You two did not do enough. You know why? Because you weren't doctors. Okay? You're not a doctor, not a lawyer, or an accountant. Fail, fail, fail.
Try harder, sorry.
All right, so I think we're gonna have a conversation about the future of Chinese cuisine, where you two see it. You two are such visionaries and evangelists for the cuisine, but I think we need to start with a bit of a baseline. So where do you see the current state of Chinese cuisine? And I think we need to separate it out, looking at it from a North American perspective and then what's happening in China. Eva, Lucas?
I think when we're thinking about where Chinese food is today, there are aspects to it that are exciting and worth being optimistic about. And then there are little parts that I am a little more pessimistic or sad about, right? We'll start with nasty stuff. So I opened this restaurant called Nice Day, and the hope is to revitalize Chinese American food. And don't get me wrong, like I'm talking about General Tso's chicken and lo mein and chicken balls and that sort of stuff. The reason is because in 2019, and this is, has anyone here seen The Search for General Tso's or read the book Jennifer A. Lee wrote, Fortune Cookie Chronicles? In that book, she names 26,000 Chinese restaurants, and she famously says it's more than Burger King, Taco Bell's, and McDonald's combined. If you were to go through Yelp and you mine through every single restaurant that's tagged as a Chinese restaurant, and you take away the people that double up as Chinese Japanese, you'll find 46,000 Chinese restaurants in 2019. That is so many Chinese restaurants. And this is in the United States because I'm based in New York. In 2021, October, we ran the data again, and we're looking at 33,000. So that's a huge decline in Chinese restaurants. We lost 13,000 of them over the course of the pandemic. And this is and some of these factors are to do with, the anti-Asian sort of racism that you've read about, but most of it actually has to do with more deeper economic issues like supply chains and that sort of stuff. You have people like us who are younger. Maybe we have parents that might have run Chinese takeout restaurants in the past, but we don't want to go back to those restaurants anymore because most of us are, let's say, lawyers and engineers and doctors and so on and so forth. So Chinese food is certainly taking a turn. That doesn't mean, though, that Chinese food is less popular than it ever was. We're looking at the second most popular takeout in North America. After pizza, it's Chinese food. And so you see this change of what we used to think, well, not we, but perhaps most North Americans thought of Chinese food as a sort of Chinese American food. On the other hand, what I am very optimistic about is the Chinese food in North America that is now surprisingly and more interestingly regional. People are opening restaurants that tell personal stories, right? They're saying, I'm not just from China, right? I'm from Hunan, and this is a Hunanese dish. A friend of mine opened a restaurant in 2019. It was a Sichuanese restaurant, but it wasn't just mala, red stuff, right? It was from Zigong. And they made bright green, herbal, non-red looking Sichuan dishes. That, to me, is very, very exciting, and a lot of that cuisine is carried now by creatives and also a different type of immigrant, a different type of Chinese immigrant.
Eva, you're seeing some of that in Toronto. Where do you see the state of Chinese cuisine right now?
It's very exciting right now. It's growing. For me, I go back to what chefs have to look forward to. As Lucas said, coming out of culinary school. Back in my day, it was Martin Yan. that was it. You know, but I don't, as exciting as it is to see him on TV, I don't aspire to be him.
You guys know Yan can cook? Yeah, this room.
And
knows.
you can cook.
Yeah, you can too. Yeah. I think he was on the CBC, I think. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I grew up watching him.
But yeah, like Martin Yan was it, you know, and I don't aspire to be him, but I think nowadays there are a lot of young Chinese chefs who can come out and see a lot of chefs pushing out. You know, Lucas is one of them in Toronto. My friend Colin just took over his dad's restaurant, and he's pushing it. He's recreating a bar experience in a Chinese restaurant of 25 years. You know, he's taking it a long way from his dad's time. So there's, you know, our generation's really doing a lot of things that's pushing forward, and I think more than ever, the future of Chinese right now is the inspiration coming from that. It's actually having something to look forward to. For me, like, I'll never forget the excitement I had when Anita Lowe came up. The first time I had her foie gras dumplings, like, I can never forget that feeling, and that was one experience. But I think now you can have that experience a lot more because of all these restaurants showing up and all these chefs sharing that. And with that inspiration, I hope more Chinese young chefs want to cook Chinese food.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you two are very inspiring in that sense. And obviously, there's a lot of excitement, a lot of development in what we're and as we're talking about Chinese food. But at the same time, when you think about, you know, internationally, what's considered the ideal for cooking standards, it's French food. And if you look at it from Asian cuisines, Japanese is held up as that standard. So despite the history and the popularity of Chinese food, why do you think it's not necessarily respected the same way?
When we're breaking down this idea of respect, you know, you're right that it doesn't have to do with, it almost isn't, it's not linearly sort of correlated with like popularity of the cuisine, right? It's not like we eat French food every day. But the way I think about it is that if you were to cook a non-French cuisine, you would often find yourself appealing to French techniques to perhaps bolster the flavor or improve it, right? To enhance it, or perhaps even to elevate it, right? All these like careful words. Same thing for Japanese cuisine, and I certainly grew up that way too. I learned to cook Japanese food in Japan because I thought it was the best food in the world. For Chinese food, I would love to see the respect for Chinese cuisine in terms of its technique, in terms of the lens through which Chinese chefs see the world and see ingredients. I would love for one day for people to be able to appeal to Chinese techniques from different regions to cook food that isn't quite Chinese. And right now, still, I would probably argue, even since Martin Yan, a lot of the times when we think about when we get ideas from Chinese cuisine, we're still making Chinese food. I would love one day that a French chef perhaps would appeal to Chinese techniques, and that's sort of the respect. Obviously, there are a bunch of other things we can talk about, like price. We don't pay very much for Chinese food, despite the labor and the intricacy involved. And obviously, we can also talk about different like supply chain economics and those sorts of boring things. But that do importantly lead to Chinese food not being as held up as a luxury cuisine, the way that oftentimes Japanese cuisine and French cuisine, for example, get held up to.
Eva, your thoughts?
You know, just to follow up what he said, it's not just techniques, but even the pantry. You know, like what is a Canadian American or North American pantry? How, you know, I can tell you right now that 9 out of 10 of my North American friends, born and raised, have soy sauce in their pantry. And then half of them have kimchi. And you keep peeling back all these things. Why are these still in the ethnic shelf when it is just as North American as milk and cream? You know, you use it just as much. And I no longer want to be like, oh, we're just going to add a little bit of soy sauce just for umami. It's not just for umami. Just even understanding soy sauce. I want to see more than just Kikkoman in the shelves. Like, I want to see like real Chinese soy sauce on the shelves, you know? So for me, like embracing that pantry every day is something that I really want to see more, and understanding that is just as important to North American cuisine and culture as milk and cream.
So what do you think the bigger mainstream is missing about Chinese cuisine? Why are they not there yet? You guys are there. I think many of us sitting in this room were. No. I mean, like you guys get it. Mm-hmm. But what is everybody else missing about Chinese cuisine? What are they not seeing that the two of you have seen?
I really don't think we talk about this all the time. We don't know anything about Chinese cuisine. Like we're probably we've probably dedicated the rest of our lives to trying to understand it, and we honestly do feel like we're just scratching the surface, right?
The more we learn, the more I'm like, oh, we don't know.
Right.
we do not know.
And I mean, the reason is maybe that, you know, was it 56 something ethnic minorities?
Yeah, there's over 50.
At least 23 provinces.
And like we are Han, like our skin color, the way, you know, from our ancestors, we are the Han ethnicity. And that does generate for 83% of the population in China. But just that alone consists of the 8 regional cuisines of China, just that. And then you look at the 56 ethnic minorities in China who has 56 types of cuisine,
Right.
all in a melting pot in a country.
Yeah. I mean, Chinese food is ridiculously diverse and is ridiculously deep. Dude, the other day, they found a 4,000-year-old noodle. Like, they were just like looking at urns and stuff. And they open this like vacuum-sealed urn, and they like look inside, they carbon date it, and they find this 4,000-year-old noodle. We've been making noodles in China for 4,000 years. Think of all the other stuff that we've been doing. So in order to make a noodle, you have to grind it, right? You have to understand like tensile strength and all these things, and like build this dough, cut it up, and do all these ridiculously wonderful things. It's always a pity when people think of Chinese food as one thing, when they think of it as monolithic. It's important to understand why, right? Like, you know, that sweet and sour sort of Chinese Canadian, Chinese American sort of flavor profile was the first attempt to bring in Chinese cuisine into the public, and it became very, very popular. But I think it's about time that we understand that Chinese cuisine can be a little bit more fragmented, right? We can start to understand the different parts of it, such that when someone says to Chinese cuisine, to me, it's almost as if you're saying European cuisine. It is so like every single thing is so different from each other.
Yeah, so what are some of the common misconceptions around Chinese cuisine that you wish, you know, your peers at diners, that people would know, that people would realize? Eva.
Yeah, no, that's actually a big thing.
Yeah, not everything is soy sauce. I swear to God, people.
Yeah, nobody
think
really
there's
cooks with soy sauce
every
that
time. They're like, oh, I'm gonna make a Chinese. Like, I've had colleagues making staff meal. I'm like, oh, what are you making? I'm like, don't worry, I'm gonna make a Chinese. And he like starts dumping in soy sauce. I'm like, okay. All right, we're gonna have a conversation later. But you know, like the misconception for me is like even understanding what condiments you use for what. You know, why is it being used? Like, if you can take the time to learn that lemon and dill goes with seafood, then you have the time to understand XO sauce goes with what. When do we use fermented bean curd? And these are stories that has, you know, been erased in the course of time. And we are now trying to recover our culture through broken stories and silenced voices. Yeah. So that's already the tougher aspect of it.
So why do you say that we're trying to recover from, you know, broken stories? Where is that coming from?
Well, you know, I speak for, you know, I'm an immigrant's granddaughter and daughter, and, you know, there are stories that I know my parents will never share with me. I don't know what the reason is behind it, whether it's trying to protect me or it's too painful to them, but I see more and more of these stories being muted from the generations before us because of many reasons. But there is like this gate, and that includes recipes, that includes techniques and history that are just not being passed on to us. Right. And where sometimes it feels like, you know, Lucas sometimes and I are cooking, it feels like we're groping in the dark. Right. It's like, I think this is how they do it, I wonder, you know, and we're just asking all these questions, but it would have been so much easier if the gateways were open, much more open at least.
Yeah. I think, like, especially from a cooking perspective, it's surprisingly hard, despite our obvious interest in Chinese food, to get access to the information, the recipes, the ingredients, and the techniques that form and are the basis of Chinese food. I was lucky enough to have claimed a sabbatical early in my career where every month I would take a month off and cook in a different part of China, like stage, we call it, right? Like an apprenticeship of sorts. And every single time I walked into any kitchen, whether it's in Chengdu or Shanghai or Dongbei or wherever, the chef would always ask, why in the world would you possibly want to learn this cuisine? We're like, you don't, like, they like are baffled by the idea of somebody going to a kitchen and wanting to learn how to cook, right? And I was like, first of all, this stuff is delicious. Like, can I please like learn how to do it because I enjoy this? And also, like, why would you want to dedicate the rest of your life to cooking? Cooking is not a very glamorous job, and there is a certain degree of, sometimes it's, you know, recipe gatekeeping, sometimes it's protecting secrets of the trade, other times it's just a lack of understanding from a lot of these like last generation chefs on why the young generation would want to learn it, and therefore why would they want to put the effort into teaching you. We're cooking at Regal Mansion next week, and we walked in and we were very, very excited. We said, Chef, we are so excited to cook with you. We can't wait to learn everything from you. And what he said back to us was, no. It's just Chinese food. I was like, whoa, what do you mean? He's like, no, it's just Chinese food. Like, it's like, and you guys like, oh, you guys do your Western thing, you know, like, it's just Chinese food. And that's the stable sort of like average sort of like mentality you find in almost every Chinese kitchen that I've ever stepped foot in.
Yes, that is true. Because the other day we were at Chef's Choice, and he said like the youngest chef in the kitchen was like 50 years old. It's just
Can
like,
you believe this? We were like, hey, we're talking about the changing industry, and like, I hope young kids are here to learn your delicious food. And then you're like, how young is youngest chef in the kitchen? And he was like, 50. I was like, 50? Like, that's crazy. Yeah. Like,
It was like, Lucas, we'll come back in 30 years.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, you know, the two of you seem to have such clarity about who you are as chefs, as cultural ambassadors. How did you both come to find your voice in the industry?
Lunar New Year, custom traditions, I guess. You know, like, the pandemic was really hard on the entire industry. You know, every restaurant, everyone tried everything from opening up shop to takeout to meal plans, any possible thing you think of. We have been trying to survive for the past few years, and you know, Momofuku, the company I was working for, have also tried everything: burgers, pizza, anything you can think of. And you know, when holidays rolled by, I was just like, well, I'm really looking forward to Lunar New Year, and I want to celebrate it. And it was really hard to access anything with Chinese restaurants closed for me. And it's the first year I couldn't leave to visit my family and celebrate it. So I had this passion project where I was determined to bring Lunar New Year to Toronto through Momofuku. So I applied to create this meal kit. And, you know, at first I was like, oh, it's fun. You know, we'll sell a couple meal kits. It'll be fun. We ended up selling 367. Mm-hmm. We generated a lot of revenue, and
You said it was more popular than your...
it was more popular any meal kit that we have pushed out through a pandemic, and that just gave me courage. And I went all out. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm gonna sell some noodles and stuff. I dug deep. I'm like, if I'm gonna do Lunar New Year, I'm gonna do it properly. You know, I made sure there's 8 dishes on the menu, so it was representing 8. You know, I made sure that I steamed rice cakes from scratch. Like, I did everything as if I was there in my family celebrating Lunar New Year. And, you know, I think in a time of crisis and pandemic, you know, you're extra vulnerable, you're questioning all these life decisions. Why am I still cooking? What's happening? And the fact is I found joy. Me and my entire team found joy cooking that. And I was like, okay, if this brings me joy, I need to dig deep. And since then, you know, I've only been cooking more and more authentically and vulnerable, I guess. I'm trying to discover this. And then the fact that I'm able to find someone, when we eat Chinese food, me and Lucas, it's not just like, oh, this is really yummy. Oh, this is something my mom made for me. No, we are talking about dishes that don't even exist in Hong Kong right now. This is pre-1992 days. Mm-hmm. There are dishes that you can't even find right now. And only maybe 1 restaurant in Toronto serves it, 2 restaurants in Richmond would make it. And when we dig deep into that, it opens a whole lot of other things that we decide to discover. And through that, I'm realizing, okay, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to doing this.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
Give me an example of some of these pre-1992 dishes.
Well, even just this one dish that we're going to make in our upcoming dinner on Tuesday, yok siu mai. It is fish siu mai. You look at siu mai now, they're this big.
Yeah.
They are filled with pork, very delicious. Like, don't get me wrong, I love all the siu mais out there. But I have vivid memories of running at a small, it's a small bus, that it's a public transportation in Hong Kong, and it's a minivan, and I'm running and I miss it. And while I'm waiting, I go buy curry fish balls and, you know, satay sauce with small tiny little bite-sized fish, pure white, smooth, bouncy siu mai. And you don't see that anymore. Nobody wants to whip fish for siu mai. Everyone's just doing pork now. And the bigger, the better for value. Nobody wants to make small pieces and you know, make 1,000 just to get 20 portions. But, you know, these are some small dishes that no one remembers. And, like, I think when we write menus together, we're really digging deep. We're not just trying to be like, oh, let's make another noodle dish. We're like, what do we not know? And I think that is what's going to help with understanding Chinese culture and cuisine.
When we're thinking about sort of cuisines or dishes even that we don't know, I think when we're thinking about the modernity or the modernization of Chinese food, young chefs like us, I don't think we'll ever be able to go through I don't think we'll ever be able to recreate it authentically, right? Like a great example that we did the other day for a dinner we did in Toronto was the bamboo noodles, right? Like joksengmin. So it's the basis of like wonton noodles, right? It's really cool because you take a long bamboo pole, you bounce on it, and that like activates the gluten, gets it bouncy and all these things. And there are other ways to do it scientifically now. But point is, like, we look at a dish like this, which is not made like that in Hong Kong anymore, and it's really important to understand it and really respect the tradition that it came from and understand the science, right? Why these noodles are produced this way, the history of it, where these ideas and these techniques come from. But we're not understanding it that way to produce it like that for a multitude of reasons. And I don't think we would be sort of brazen enough to try to recreate it exactly how it used to be recreated. But we can take those ideas into the type of food that we are making today and infuse it with the modern ideas, right? Perhaps. And that to me is a great answer to the question of like, why in the world is there fusion food, right? Like who gets to cook what food is a deep understanding and respect for the traditions that come before you. And if you understand it, then you can make food that honestly reflects that understanding, like that reference point, without having to be stuck in this sort of like borders of or restraints of authenticity.
That was one of my questions I didn't ask in the first section. First session was about authenticity. You know, I know, Lucas, you definitely have a take on it. I'm curious to hear as well from Eva. You know, what do you guys think? What does it mean to be authentic? When is it cultural appropriation? Mm-hmm. When is it fusion? And what does it mean to evolve a cuisine?
We're not quite allowed to. I think the word authentic is sometimes weaponized, you know, when you tell your friends, like, I found this delicious dumpling place. And then some dude is like, yo, I found a place that's more authentic. I was like, wait, like, more authentic? You're like, what do you mean more authentic? Do you mean more ethnic? Or do you like mean more delicious, right? It's a really sort of like misunderstood word. And sometimes they're like, no, I know it better than you, that type of thing. And the reason is because when you think about authenticity, it's really difficult to think about a single bite of food or a dish or even a restaurant as representative of a culture in an honest way, right? The difficulty is that culture. I would never claim for my food to be authentically Chinese as much as it is honestly just like authentic to my experience of China. And that is given that I am Chinese, right? It's important to reflect that, right? Like, it's my attitude and my understanding of culture. If I had to put something in front of all of you and said, this is authentic to China, that would be the greatest burden in the world on my shoulders to say, this dish represents all of Chinese culture. It makes Chinese culture so tiny, and it's diminutive, right? And that's not cool, and also just not an honest reflection of what we're trying to do as chefs when we're trying to tell our story.
I agree 100% to everything he's saying. To me, authenticity, I'm just authentic to my story and where I've been through, and that I'm translating it through this dish. That's the most authentic I will be. It's just my own experiences. It is a huge burden to ever say in Chinese cuisine's lens. It's the biggest burden to ever say, this is authentic Chinese noodle. I'm like, Chinese noodle? Let's sit down and have a 6-hour conversation right now. Do you really want to talk about noodles and the authenticity behind it? So for me, it's never about, I'm never going to try or strive to make the most authentic Chinese food, the most tastiest Chinese food. It is just food that's unique to me through the understanding of Chinese cuisine and my upbringing and the culture behind it.
So I want to know then, if somebody from outside the culture comes in and tries to cook something that's...
You just trying to bait us to say mean things about our friends?
Save it. Tell me, what do you think when the white peoples come and they try to make the food and then they say that, this is Chinese food, or it's like, I'm elevating it, or I'm, taking it to the next level. When is that okay, and when do we see that when do we call that, or just like, okay, that feels like cultural appropriation? Or when is that just, borrowing an influence or trying to create something new?
I mean, if we find another term for, like, adjacent to appropriation, right? Like, cultural confluence is a huge part of all cuisine, obviously. I was working on a Peking duck recipe the other day, talking to some food historians, and we're digging through this cookbook that was written in the Yuan Dynasty, 1330s. And this these group of food historians believe, is the first recipe for cooking domesticated duck in an imperial context. Therefore, it's a predecessor for Peking duck. We've all had or understand Peking duck, right? Crispy skin, the whole thing. This duck's recipe is 2 lines. It's a duck that is steamed inside of a lamb stomach with coriander and onions, and then served. Nothing to do with Peking duck, really. Like, how in the world is that the predecessor of it? But it is the first imperial preparation of duck, of domesticated duck. Now, this recipe was written by somebody who is from modern-day Turkey, who is the pharmacist, the Chinese medicine doctor for the emperor of China at the time. Now, if that is what becomes Peking duck today, then that's just an example of how food must be a product of the confluence of cultures, that there's nothing truly authentic to only one culture, right? And you have to adapt this idea that everything is influences each other. Now, when non-Chinese people, for example, make Chinese food, I think sometimes we can get quite upset about it. But the greatest arbiter of all fusion of all time is deliciousness. If something is delicious, it'll stay. Great Chinese American example. You guys know crab rangoon? Actually, I know a lot of people don't.
Okay, I saw you talk about crab rangoon in another talk, so I had to search what crab rangoon is, because I have never eaten a crab rangoon before.
Okay, fine. A crab rangoon is a deep fried wonton that's filled with cream cheese. It's like the top 5. It's one of the top 5 like Chinese American dishes ever ordered in takeout. It's a ridiculous thing.
I think in Chinese it's called hai gao, which is that what it's called? I think that to me made more sense.
Imitation crab.
Imitation crab, mostly a little bit.
Roll,
Yeah.
sushi roll imitation.
Surimi.
California roll.
Right.
Crab.
And so this crab rangoon, the story of this crab rangoon, how did it become one of the most Chinese American dishes, or even the most Chinese dishes in America, is that in the 1950s, people come back from the war, and Chinese chefs take advantage of tiki culture, and Chinese chefs appropriate all of tiki culture into scorpion bowls and sweet and sour sauce and pineapples and stuff and crab rangoons, which is named after a non-place, Rangoon, right? So complicated history, right? Point is, like, Chinese people are also, right, importantly, like, indicted, I suppose, in that appropriative
We're just as
process,
bad.
right? No, not quite just as bad, right? But over time, this as a delicious food item has made its way into the tradition of Chinese food, right? And so the deliciousness as an arbiter of like what is going to stay, like tradition takes time to develop. And so if something is delicious, point is, all of this is a long-winded way to say, sometimes when I find myself a little upset that somebody's misrepresenting the food that I grew up with, I ask myself, is it delicious, and will it be delicious 50 years from now? And hopefully that will, if it is delicious enough, it'll bring it into mainstream culture, and it'll bring it into like popular understanding of what that cuisine could possibly be.
That is true, because when Eva and I really took issue with this dumpling we saw online, Lucas was a very moderate voice going, perhaps this interesting shape could actually work. So, yes, you were very, very good with that, Lucas. So, you know, the two of you have this outstanding understanding and knowledge of Chinese cuisine. I know you guys say you've just scratched the surface, but I want to know, like, how much time are you dedicating outside of the kitchen to actually learning about Chinese cuisine?
All day, every day.
All day, every day.
Non-stop.
Non-stop, 24/7. I'm always thinking about it, and always trying to understand it. And I find myself more than ever, when I get interested about something about Chinese cuisine or culture, I don't just stop at there. Once I find out, like, let's say a name of a dish, once I Google it and I find out, I don't just stop there. I immediately go through everything and anything to do with it and how it became. And, you know, I would look up to the history, the predecessors of how it become. And I think that's what's important, is understanding the progression. I think progression is very important for any cuisine in the world, because it represents a history and a progression of the country and the people, the economic growth and geographic growth of the place. You know, for me, I've always tied Chinese cuisine to the geography of China, not just by province, but even how it's attached to the main sources of the water. You know, Huanghe, Yangtze River, like what and how and parts of this water source connects and changes the cuisine of that region. And just understanding that, just like, like I said, it constantly reminds me that I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, for sure. So much of the geography shapes the type of food that we end up seeing on plates, right? So where does this passion and commitment to evangelizing Chinese cuisine come from? Like, where does that stem from for the two of you? Lucas?
I told the story in last time. I would love to tell it again, because it really is like I only realized it when I was telling it that passion just doesn't come out of anywhere, right? There's like, especially for chefs who are supposed to be rock stars and super cool and all these things, like there's an assumption that we are born with passion, right? Or we are passionate people. We're just passionate about things out the womb. That doesn't seem to be the case. I think it's really important to think about passion because oftentimes it's cultivated, and I will do everything in my power to point to Eva to say, like, Eva is one of the best people that I've ever cooked next to that is teaching people how to be passionate about Chinese cuisine, even if they didn't grow up with it, right? And that passion, I mean, for me, it came from, I used to cook in this restaurant in Japan called Kikunoi Honten. It's like a world's 50 best 3 Michelin star restaurant. I think it's one of the best Japanese restaurants, if I may say so myself, in Japan. And it's really old school kaiseki type of place. And on the last day that I was cooking there, the chef invited me into his home. His home is our home. We all lived in the restaurant together. All the men showered together and slept in bunk beds. All the women like were front of house and lived in a separate building. It was an insane workplace. But as the chef invited me into his home, he's like, okay, last day you're here, final thoughts, any questions for me? And I was like, can you just like tell me about how you got to where you are today? I was on a backpacking tour in Japan, and I landed in this restaurant because I was under the impression that Japanese cuisine is the best food in the world. I was most excited about Japanese cuisine. I thought it was so elegant. I wanted to learn it. I wanted to become a Japanese chef. Chef Yoshihiro Murata tells me his story, and his father opened this restaurant, Kikunoi. He goes to France backpacking under the guise that French food is the best food in the world. He goes to France, he's cooking there, having a good time, suddenly realizes, because he's constantly making staff meal, like family meal for staff before service, and every time he's cooking for everybody else, they're like, hey, can you make some Japanese food? And he's starting to cook Japanese food, and he realizes that he's Japanese. It takes him going all the way over to France to realize that he's Japanese. He comes back, he takes over his father's restaurant, makes it one of the best restaurants in the world. I'm sitting here in Japan making Chinese staff meal for everyone, making mapo tofu and gyoza and all these things, and wondering to myself, oh shoot, you are right, I am Chinese. Like, go all the way back to New Haven, Connecticut, and like meet some people and open a Chinese restaurant. It's like sometimes it takes a little bit of that activation, but I was very lucky to have chef cultivate that sort of passion for Chinese food in me. To realize that I had that interest, and that interest is stronger than so many other things because it's in my blood.
For sure. And Eva, how did yours come to be?
I think just following up that story, it was like, I was in the middle of pandemic. Everyone around me was miserable in the industry, and rightfully so. It was very hard. And I felt guilty because I was having the time of my life cooking Chinese food. And I was very blessed with a wonderful team who followed me and followed the food that I cook. And through their excitement and their enjoyment and acceptance of the Chinese food I was cooking, I was like, I am so proud of this. And Chinese food is awesome. Like, what am I doing? And it was just that moment where I'm like, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to promoting and learning about Chinese food and culture.
How important has it been to have champions in your guys' lives as chefs to create the brand, the persona, and the identity that you guys have forged for yourselves? People lifting you up and supporting the work that you guys are doing.
Just
Like her.
just
These two call themselves long lost cousins.
So facetious.
They actually look identical in their passport photos, though.
Shockingly, actually. I think, for me, when I arrived in Toronto, within 6 months, Trevor Louis, if you guys ever, he has a cookbook called Double Happiness. He's amazing. He slipped in my DMs. He's like, hi, chef. It's the middle of a pandemic, and I just wanted to extend on behalf of the Chinese community of Toronto, welcome. And I'm like, I've never received a text like this in 7 years in Vancouver. I'm sorry, but, and then 6 months after, Craig Wong, chef of Patois, sent me another DM with the same, and there is the community that I am suddenly accepted to reminded me like who I am and why am I doing this. And I think I was very lucky, that Toronto gives me all these inspirations to learn from. Trevor's trying to revive, Canadian Chinese food. Craig Wong's trying to revive Chinese Jamaican food. Colin, my friend, is trying to revive like Canadian Chinese food through his 25-year-old restaurant from his parents, And then I meet Lucas from New York, who's just like actually understands all these deep cut references to Cantonese cuisine and actually understands the pain of not knowing enough. I think it's that thirst, that connection immediately probably brighten up the fire.
That's very cool.
I mean,
Lucas, I know you want to add something.
No, it's exactly the same. I mean, we're very lucky that we're a lot of our heroes are our peers in the industry who are doing things that we're doing. I remember during the pandemic, I'm sure you were in one too, everyone all the chefs, all the restaurateurs were suddenly in all these group chats because everybody was texting each other, what should we do next? How we're going to help? How we're going to feed the people, the first responders in the hospital? How we're going to raise money for anti-Asian, against anti-Asian racism, and so on and so forth. And I'm really lucky that there are people like Eva. There are so many chefs in Toronto. My version of Soil Club is this silly thing we call Shy Boys Club. We make introverted Asian cuisine. And it's all chefs of basically our age, trying to open restaurants of their own and trying to assert themselves and learning from them as we sort of forge our way ahead and grope in the dark for, technical things like recipes, but also just higher level, what does it mean to be to be a first generation immigrant in this country? It's very, very, very helpful.
But I think we laugh when you say introverted Chinese cuisine, but that means something, right?
Right.
What do you mean by, explain to the people, what do you mean by saying introverted?
We wrote our, we wrote our brand brief, our modus operandi after we named it Shy Boys Club. We just named it Shy Boys Club because we didn't want people to take photos of us when we were out, so we would do this. But introverted Asian cuisine is introverted because we serve food that we're too shy to cook in our own restaurants. I have a bunch of fast casual restaurants. My main co-chef, Eric, has a bunch of Taiwanese restaurants. He's only allowed to cook Taiwanese food in his restaurants because he has a Taiwanese restaurant. Right. I'm only allowed to make fast casual food because I have a fast casual restaurant. So this is our opportunity to cook food that is perhaps something a little bit more lighthearted, and to remind people that we're not restricted by the boundaries that the Yelp or the Google sort of category puts us in.
And so why are the two of you so passionate and so committed to reviving and preserving the future of Chinese cuisine? What is it for you? What does it do for you?
I think it's because it's delicious and we want to make delicious food, and we just truly believe that this is our favorite food to eat. So obviously it's the food that we like to cook, right?
Are you worried about the future of Chinese cuisine? Do you feel like we are, obviously off the top, you mentioned that we're seeing this huge decline in the number of Chinese restaurants in America. There is, I don't think, I'm looking at Alex and Mia and these folks who are far better researched than I am. There is no actual count of how many Chinese restaurants there are in the country, are there? Because I think it's actually the Chinese American Association of America that's actually came up with that number of 45,000. But I don't think there is one in Canada.
You can't even get a straight number on Richmond.
Right, yeah, exactly. All I did was I did simple math and was maybe we're 10% of what that number is. But, are you concerned? Are you worried? Why is this so important?
I am very concerned.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're right. There's so many Chinese restaurants in Canada, in Vancouver and Toronto alone. How many of them are actually recognized and appreciated for what they do? And how many other establishments are so inspired by the food they share, and instead of sharing them, they take their ideas and elevate it. Elevate it. And it hits a different market, and all of a sudden, boom, Chinese food is hip from that one dish, one inspiration.
Right.
So yeah, it does concern me that if we do not dig deeper and find out more stories and more food from these mom and pop shops, small shops that are not on any accolades or any list, that we're gonna forget that where did this come from? Where did this hip new Chinese dish in a fusion restaurant come from?
Yeah. When we're saying elevate, we did it in air quotes because the assumption is that Chinese food is low, therefore it needs to be elevated, right? And getting rid of that assumption is one. And the second is embracing some type of I don't know, I think I am worried, but I'm optimistic because I think there are people who are doing something about it. And I think it needs to be done at like multiple levels, right? I mean, honest, dude, I make sesame noodles like back in New York. Like it's like when I'm thinking about the progression of Chinese food, it's like building a house. There's a foundation, there's a stuff in between, there's a stuff that's high, and like so happened that the segment that I chose to be in the beginning is like the stuff that's democratic, like the sweet green chipotle, like you know Wendy's type of world, right? But it's important that people are in the in between, and that we keep pushing for like creative, like aesthetic, really exciting, interesting cuisine at a high level too. I would really hope that everybody in the community and in the industry is pushing at all of those levels.
You know, what makes me optimistic is second generations like, you know, Will from Kamwai. You know, I have many friends who are taking over their family's businesses, Chinese meat packers, Chinese seafood. You know, I have Renee who's making, you know, fermented black garlic hoisin sauce and trying to hit a different market in a more healthier, you know, like dietary restricted market. Like that is what's going to give me hope. That's what's going to give me optimism. And they're the people that's making me and Lucas be like, okay, let's do this together. I don't feel so alone.
You should tell people about like you were telling me the other day that a lot of the people who are helping us do these events with suppliers, right? When you first met them when you were at Boulevard.
Yeah, I was really, really excited about this specific dinner. Obviously, it's a coming home dinner for me, but also, you know, there are friends that I made in Vancouver in the past 7-8 years that I was working here who are not chefs, who are like Asian accountants, doctors, engineers, Deloitte, you know, tax people, but and when I got to know them, their parents actually own meat packers, seafood markets, and like really cool like Chinese food establishments. I'm like, oh, and as a chef, I'm like, I can't wait for you to take over. And I'm like, I don't want anything to do with that.
Right.
I'm good here, you know? But pandemic happened, and obviously everyone wanted to help their parents. And fast forward now, they've all taken over their family's company, and they're coming to help me with this dinner. And that is like a full circle for me. And that's what's gonna give me hope, and you know, like them.
Very cool. Kamway Dim Sum Spot. They do frozen dumplings and baos and all kinds of things in Chinatown. Very cool. So thank you for joining us. So I think we are going to open it up for questions. I think we've got about 15 minutes. If the floor is open to you guys. Yes, back there. First one. Up on the chair. Very excited. Go ahead with your question.
So speaking as obviously I'm kind of outside the community. One of the things that I find, like I'm lucky to have a partner in Renee who can, you know, bring me to new restaurants, and you know, she generally just orders and I trust her and I can eat it. But one of the things that I find to be a big obstacle with Chinese food is that when I go into the restaurants, a lot of them, especially locally anyways, the menus are all in Chinese. Some of them might have English, but it's just like pork noodles, pork noodles, pork noodles. There's like 30 versions of pork and noodles. There's no education. There's no, it doesn't seem like there's any interest in actually welcoming people in to educate and to show them like, this is what things are and this is the difference. So I'd just love to know kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we talked about this a bit in the first session. You guys.
I mean, there's, I don't know if it's like the lack of interest to educate so much as it is a question of accessibility. And I think there's something that can be done about it. There are these wonderful organizations in New York that we work with that have been building things like websites and translating menus specifically, right, for Chinatown restaurants that didn't have the ability to translate it because they don't speak English that way, right? They're being onboarded to e-commerce platforms, to delivery, right? In a way that, I don't know if you care to hash out the problems with food delivery, but there's a negotiation process for the percentage that the company takes from you. And a lot of these young folks, during the pandemic especially, in the hope of helping Chinese restaurants, are doing these negotiations on part in English, right, for these restaurants. So something can be done, and it is oftentimes a question of accessibility. And I actually think that's quite low-hanging fruit. It would be quite interesting, and hopefully, I would feel a lot more optimistic about things if we all could start going to our restaurants and say, hey, what do you need help with, and start from there.
Yeah, that's great.
I was
Me?
going to ask, like, don't you see yourselves as part of an era? Like, I think there's a lot of Mexican chefs going through the same thing you are, like going to France, going to Europe, learning how to cook their way, and then realizing, hey,
You're right. Yeah.
there's a huge civilization of cooking back home. And And I've talked to a lot of chefs from there that say the same thing. They went back, just really inspired.
Yeah.
And, you know, other cultures as well. Maybe it's just that the era for it.
Right. Yeah. It does. I mean, it takes. You know, so many of your friends are doing the same thing.
Time's a bit different here in North America and in China. You know, like, obviously politically it's a little bit more closed up, you know, more than ever through pandemic. And it makes us so oblivious how much farther they are, how celebrated chefs are there, how many chefs have come home. You know, 海鲜回归, you know, they come home, a hero's welcome home, and like done cooking European food, done staging in Europe, and are here to embrace. And that is happening. That has been happening for the past 6-7 years, and we are at the peak of it in Hong Kong, China. But we have no idea here in North America about that. And I think that is also affecting, you know, how the Chinese food is growing in North America. I think that's very important to have to realize and understand.
Yeah, I think we talked about New York and how the Korean restaurants are really, they've got a bit of an ecosystem that's really fostered some amazing development in there. The number of restaurants that have become Michelin starred over the last 2 years, it's a very different scene than what we're experiencing in Chinese cuisine.
Yeah, I think certainly for Chinese food, there's this. It's implicit oftentimes when we're thinking about ethnic cuisines that they are cuisines of history, that they're in the past, and therefore they don't quite move because they're in the past. And we forget that there are a lot of Chinese people in China, and they eat like 3 times a day, and that food is continuing to progress. But obviously, politics is part of it, like different social medias and so on and so forth. It's hard often for us to like see what's happening over there. And Korean example, the Korean cuisine is a great example. You know, we can't get as much information from China often as freely, right, as many Korean chefs do. But the system that I find super interesting that Lien is referring to is, I think modern Korean food in New York right now is like the best. It is so good. These restaurants are like Koji, Jua, Attaboy, Atamix, Lise, Oijimi, so on and so forth, right? And I'll give you the brief if you're interested in the restaurant side of things. So how do these things work? There's an amazing hospitality group called Han Hospitality that opens a lot of these restaurants. They tap really wonderful chefs. Where do these chefs come from? They all go to the CIA or the French Culinary Institute or whatnot. They graduate, top of the class, because they're just really good at what they do. And then they all work at really great French restaurants where they build a lot of technique, right? And then many of them work at this one restaurant called Chongsik that is a 2 Michelin star Korean place. Chongsik is a training ground, right? Run by Korean chefs. The kitchen is mostly operated in Korean. For other younger Korean chefs, no matter where they come from, where they got their culinary education, they come out, they graduate from the system, and then they open their own restaurants. And obviously, they are so freaking fantastic. And there's some economics behind that allow them to have the funding to open these wonderful restaurants, really beautifully designed, and so on and so forth. There's a whole ecosystem, and that ecosystem it rests on a couple of individual people and individual groups that have really build this system to create modern Korean food in New York. We've lost a lot of those systems, unfortunately, in Chinese cuisine, right? The information we're not getting from China, we don't have the same hospitality group that is often Chinese run, that like spans different Chinese restaurants at different price points. We also don't have the same sort of economic and financial structure. And during the pandemic, a lot of Chinese chefs in the United States that were up and coming, that went to these, that cooked at Daniel Boulud's, at Jean Georges or whoever, like all left and went back to China to keep cooking, right? So the economics are totally different, the politics are totally different, but that is something that I use the modern Korean cuisine and New York example often in my head to ask myself, like, I really wonder if we can have something like that somewhere in North America for Chinese food.
If you guys are interested, it's Hand Hospitality.
Yeah. It stands for have a nice day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's very cool. Do we have any other questions? Really? No questions for these two?
You somehow skipped over something I thought was kind of pertinent. You said Chinese food is often inexpensive. Is that part of the problem, perhaps?
It is part of the problem. The classic example is, it was like $12 for one ravioli, but it's $12 for 4,000 Chinese dumplings, right?
Yeah.
Like you hear a lot of.
Yeah. And
yes.
Justin himself actually posted in his IG stories about that, right?
Yeah, exactly. The dumplings you had today.
Yeah.
I think there are two sides of this. One side is like, obviously, yes, that's true. There is and I suppose this is a little bit of a hot take. One is that, yes, it is ridiculous that we put in so much labor into Asian dumplings, and we don't get to charge as much for it, right? But it's also, on the other hand, it's important to realize how that came to be, right? It's not just labor, therefore more price, right? It's also the positioning of the restaurant, the way it's ordered, and all these things. I only say this because I don't want anyone here who's running a restaurant to suddenly go back and charge $12 per dumpling, because it's going to be horrible for you, right? But I would like for us to build up to that level of respect. It just can't happen overnight. Yeah.
Yeah, and we need to understand the historical context around why Chinese restaurants have historically been seen as cheap or inexpensive. It's
and in the minute,
so much as like a survival mechanism.
What can we do to get us to that level of respect, right? To have our work be honored the same way that European sort of dishes might be.
Yeah, for sure. Eva, any thoughts on that?
Same sentiments as Lucas. I think.
Actually,
I don't really. It's not that. It's like average price. But yeah, I mean, like for me, it's. I think. How do I put this?
It's average white people food price.
True.
My parents went, they'd be like, wow, come on.
That is true.
Except like, Mom, you have to pay. We should be paying.
Right.
Yeah,
But for me, I'm arguing with the part that I am elevating the price along with the progression of the dish. Like, yeah, you're right. I charge $26 for siu mai on my menu. I'm very candid here. I'm very candid here. You know, I charge 8 pieces of fish siu mai.
So it's like $13.
There's scallops in there. There's fish in there.
But they're huge.
That's $13 before is decent. I can live with that.
But I am not bringing in frozen fish from Vietnam or China. I am bringing in rockfish from BC. I am supporting a family in Elora, Ontario, that makes all my dumpling skins. You know, 0 food coloring and preservatives. I am using tomatoes from our rooftop garden to make a roasted tomato satay sauce. Like, you know, that's my play on satay curry fish balls. And, you know, I finish with basil oil and a little bit of lumpfish caviar. And so for me, I'm not trying to elevate Chinese food. To me, I'm trying to be like, how do I make siu mai with the ingredients that I have in Canada that I love so much? Because I genuinely believe in sustainability in also cooking Chinese cuisine. You know, why am I bending my back, you know, piping siu mai by hand with bad fish, bad frozen fish? I should be using the best fish to present Chinese siu mai. And so I'm also charging for the ingredients, and I'm also trying to explain to people, you know, this is the new progression of Chinese cuisine. We are using what is good now. You know, I see Chinese chefs in BC using lingcod. They're no longer bringing in grouper from Hong Kong. You know, that's what I want to see. I want to see the progression of not just the cuisine, the technique, but also the ingredients. And then that is going to explain and educate people why it always should have deserved more than $12.
Yeah, do you think it's a lack of education that we're seeing?
Lack of education, and, you know, it's just systemic oppression, you know, like, a quick 3-minute crash course is how did Chinese food become fast, cheap, and easy? You know, I'm also born and raised American, and it all started from the railway workers. You know, Chinese railway workers were given a quarter of the wage of Western railway workers. They were given a quarter of the break time. And so the first Chinese restaurant was built for them. They were an eating place for Chinese railway workers. And so the food had to be fast so they can eat it in their short break. It had to be cheap so they could afford it with their wage. It had to be affordable. And so it's so messed up to think that stemmed from that we were trying to save our own people back in the day, and now it has given us the name of being cheap, fast, and affordable.
It's such a product of racism, right? Yeah.
It's a product of racism. Yeah. Anyhow, I could really get into some of that. Okay, any other questions from the group? Oh, yes, over here.
So, Eva, you just talked about progression of Chinese food, and you both cooked all around the world. In your travels and your experience, what's been the most mind-blowing or memorable encounter of how the Chinese diaspora has taken their local influence to build their version of progression in Chinese food?
That's a great question, both Eva and Lucas. I feel everyone always wants to know, what have you guys eaten that's so delicious? Everyone wants to know that question.
I mean, there's so many examples. I'm going to hang around a bit if you want to hear the other two, let me know. One is recently I was in London and I ate at A and Andrew like really honestly like made the best Chinese food I've ever had outside of the borders of China. It was absurd. 26 courses of like dim sum that really like blew my mind. And importantly, after eating it, I was thinking to myself, this can only exist in London. It's like London style, like kitchen run, like it was just very special, and it was emblematic of how wonderful Chinese cuisine can be, even if it modernizes or evolves and changes outside the borders of China. And also the second one is about the Detroit corned beef egg roll. It's insane. The story that Eva was nudging me to tell was in Beijing, there's a restaurant called Zhiguan Xiaoguan. I went before they had a Michelin star. They got their Michelin star the first year they came to Beijing. But it's run by a woman. It's a Dongbei style restaurant, northeastern style restaurant. And really beautiful inside of an art gallery. Last course is a duck. They send out this braised duck. It's in this lid with a ceremonial thing. They take it off. You're like, oh my god, the duck's so good. And then they're like, oh, the duck is cooked in this sauce made from fish, and the fishes were the same fishes that are swimming in the rice paddies that the ducks would have like eaten, and so on and so forth. And oh, cool, right? And then as you're eating this thing, round table of chefs, like 12 of us in this big banquet sort of private room. In the middle is a clay pot that has gently been steaming the entire time. You're like, oh, I thought that was a candle. And oh, it's actually like a steaming little clay pot of rice. Server comes over, scoops 1 spoon of rice for everybody, and puts a tiny piece of lard over the top. You eat it, and they're like, oh, in case you don't know, the best rice in China is grown in the northeast, Dongbei Dami, right? Short grain, a little bit sticky, just really, really wonderfully flavorful. As you're putting that in your mouth, they bring out a wine glass. They start pouring in this wine glass from a teapot, this white liquid, and they tell you that this is a rice milk made from every single part of the plant that isn't the rice grain itself, the germ, the stalk, and all these things. And I'm sitting there just like, and they're like, oh, and in case we have to like spell it out for you, here's a whole ecosystem that you just put in your mouth with the duck and the fish and the rice and all this stuff. And I'm sitting here like, and these people don't have a Michelin star, not World 50, whatever. And sitting there, you're like, this is like Noma level, like world-class storytelling. Female run, so important, like female run in Beijing. This is her only restaurant in Beijing. She's from a little town called Panjin that many people don't know about, right? There's a little town, a 30-year-old town, and like it's ridiculous. That's how good the high end of Chinese cuisine is like right now. I haven't been back in like 2-3 years. Like imagine all the other stuff they've been doing. Not to mention the chains, the low-level stuff, right, and the cheaper stuff. It's just like Chinese food is like it's super super deep and it's continually changing.
Very similar experience to him. Mine was in Guangzhou, and I went to a restaurant that was known for tofu. And I was eating a piece of tofu that was steamed and made and ground. It's the stone mill that they've been using for I don't know how many years that they've been open, with water dripping from that valley that mills the soybean that turns into the tofu. And you're like, at first I looked at it and, I'm guilty as a French chef to be like, this is just a piece of tofu, okay. It's just literally a block of tofu on my bowl, and I'm like, I'm paying a lot of money for this piece of tofu. And I ate it, and I'm not tasting tofu, I am tasting the story and the flavor of this soybean and this water. And I think, more and more as the single origin stories of the food comes out, that is becoming my favorite meals. It's just going back to basics. But that was the best meal I've ever had.
That's a great question.
All right. Oh, Fred's got a question.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I'm curious to learn if there are more women who are entering this field, the Chinese culinary scene, and following in your footsteps and others, and how do we help?
Anna Chen.
Yeah.
Anna Chen, Alma, Toronto. Eat her food. It's fantastic. There's a huge there's very different populations of Asians in Canada. In Toronto, there's a lot of Thai people, and there's also a very specific Hakka Indian Chinese population. And she is a Hakka Chinese girl that grew up in Calcutta. And sometimes she's cooking the most amazing duck biryani. And sometimes she's making bok tan, which is really, really thin, crispy rice, sticky glutinous rice crepe, brushed with honey, rolled with sesame or peanuts, rolls it up with coconut, and oh my God, you see that in one village outside of Guangzhou, like 20 miles away. I'm like, and this girl in Toronto is making it. And she's this high, so she steps on a crate to cook on the wall.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And she's only 99 in Canada's 100 best. You know, that blows my mind. But you know, it's not a lot. But it starts from someone like her. She encourages me. We collaborated on the Lunar New Year package we did together in 2021 because she was, you know, I really wanted to support her and we found a way to do it. But there are some, and they're out there, and please support them.
Your kitchen also. Yeah, sure. It's gonna be amazing. Yeah.
All right, that was really great. I think we're almost at time, so I think I'm going to do one last question. Any message that you want to leave with the audience as we think about the future of Chinese cuisine, and you know, what we can all do to also be ambassadors in our own ways?
I think we sort of touched upon this idea a little bit. My dad used to say, if you're eating 3 times a day, just pay attention and use those 3 exposures to food as opportunities to think about the food and use your head when you're eating. Ask yourself whether you like something, and then ask yourself why you like it or why you don't like it, and then who made the food, where did the ingredients come from, where did the techniques come from, and suddenly you have this like food as a nugget or the starting point to think about culture, right? I really think that, honestly, has been my vortex, my black hole. That's why I'm so excited about food, is because it's not just about the thing that you're eating itself, it's about everything that led up to that moment, all the history and the science. And you really need to believe that the history and the science affects the way that we cook and affects the way that we eat. I'm obviously a nerd about this stuff, but it's been, the food is the very, very good starting point through which to talk about culture.
Well, he's covered cuisine and culture, so I'm only going to add in my last C, which is community. You know, you're nothing without your community. More than anything, pandemic has showed for us to stand up for our community. But really just understand that cuisine, culture, and community are all connected to each other. You can't just choose what you love and not love about Chinese food. That's something I'm learning. I don't get to pick. I love it all, and I need to understand it all.
For sure. You can't separate the two, right? Yeah. All right. Yeah, as we learned from the end of our last session, so Lily, as I mentioned, from Mission Hill, is the only Chinese sommelier over at Mission Hill. If you can believe it, they're a huge wine group. And so, you know, ask the question the next time you're at a winery, oh, how would you pair this with Chinese food? And they say to you, I don't know, I've never thought about it. And you're like, maybe you should have a Chinese sommelier, you know? So like, I think these are some of the types of things that we can do as diners to generate interest and to trigger people to think more about that question, right? So with that, I'd like to thank our 2 wonderful young but so wise chefs, Chef Lucas Sin and Chef Eva Chen. Please give it up for them. And on behalf of Lily at Mission Hill and on behalf of Justin at Potluck Hawker Eatery, thank you. And thank you to the Chinese Restaurant Awards for hosting all of us to be here today. Thank you so much, Ray, for bringing us together as a group. This was so wonderful. I hope you guys are as jazzed about Chinese cuisine as I am, as these 2 are, and that we will all do our part to try and, you know, really bring our passion to the broader community. So have a great night, you guys. I think they're going to hang about for a bit if you want to chat and get nerdy with those 2. Okay, have a good night.